right, well, let's get things going here. Hello and welcome, everyone. You are in Effective Strategies for Cybersecurity, Digital Trust, and Community Engagement webinar. We're going to take a closer look at a playbook recently released by Dr. Donna Kidwell. So InCommon's IAM Online is a monthly webinar focused on identity and access management, brought to you by InCommon and Internet2. My name is Jean Horszewski. I'm the director of InCommon Academy, and I'm your host today. We're going to get going with some introductions here, and then we'll dive into our presentation and finally our closing. But just a few housekeeping things. We will be taking questions today live and you can use the Zoom Q&A function. So please do send us your messages as you have them throughout our presentation today, and we definitely want to hear from you, and we'll be taking those questions later on in the segment here. You can also post messages in the chat, and those are for group discussion, and just be sure that you're having everyone selected in that window there. By the way, this event is being recorded, so if you registered for IAM Online, you will receive an email with a link to today's recording as well as the slides. And these materials will also be available on the InCommon website as well as our YouTube channel, so please do watch your inbox for those things. All right, well, let us dive into today's session, and I am happy to pass the virtual microphone over to Chris Misra, Vice Chancellor of Information Technology and CIO at University of Massachusetts Amherst. And Chris will provide an introduction to Dr. Kidwell. So Chris, please take it away.
Thanks so much, Jean, and thank you for giving me the honor of introducing Dr. Kidwell. So as Jean had said, I'm Chris Misra. I'm the Vice Chancellor and CIO at the University of Massachusetts. I've been involved with InCommon for a real long time at this point. And like Dr. Kidwell's current role, I came up through the Chief Information Security Officer space. So the intersection of information security and identity is a key critical one for me. So let's get into the session. I want to introduce Dr. Donna Kidwell. She's the Chief Information Security Officer and the Deputy CIO at the University of Toronto, where she's moved recently. She's dedicated to advancing digital trust and cybersecurity. She's previously held Chief Information Security and Digital Trust Officer roles at Arizona State, where she managed infrastructure and education on digital security. She holds a doctorate in business administration and a whole host of other degrees. But rather than spend time talking about Dr. Kidwell's degrees, let's get into the meat of the presentation. As Jean had mentioned, we're going to use the Q&A feature. I'm going to work to help correlate the questions, and we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. But without me talking anymore, Dr. Kidwell, I'd be happy to introduce you.
Hey, thanks, Chris. Much appreciated. And that was a delightful introduction. I'm really excited to have this conversation today with everybody because I think we're at such a liminal moment with so many things happening on our campuses, and identity being one of those places where we get just such lovely inflection points for how we move forward. So today, we're going to talk about digital trust. Before we do that, I want to very quickly, if you guys want to go see the playbook and kind of read along, I'm going to do highlights and we're going to pick out pieces of it to talk today. But my slides are going to be kind of boring in comparison to the incredible work that the team at ASU did in putting this thing together. The photographs in it are far more beautiful. So a quick opportunity for you to take a look at the playbook. I know the team from InCommon also sent out links for you. And I'm curious, I can't see the chat, but Chris, let's ask folks in the chat. Tell us where you're from, what organizations you represent. And I'm also kind of curious what roles everybody has, just so I've got a sense of like who's in the room that we're working with today. Can you help me be my eyes, and
that sounds
we'll
great.
ask folks in the
I
chat.
will correlate stuff in, and I'll poke my head in as we get that information coming in. So again, feel free to use the chat or the Q&A feature, and we'll sort of correlate that. And that works well.
100% fantastic. Okay, so let's talk about what digital trust is, especially in a world where I think most of our organizations have probably spent more than a few years trying to think of like what a zero trust mindset might look like and how to go about that. So wave your hands in the chat if that's something that you guys have been aspiring to for the last 3 to 5 years. I think in that space, one of the things that you pretty quickly realize is that as not a term of art that means much when we go out to talk to registrars or when we go out to talk to brand or marketing or athletics. And we can explain that to them and they appreciate, I think, the concept of what's behind it. But really, at the end of the day, what a lot of our organizations are seeking is digital trust. And so it's a reframing, it's a more human framing of the kind of work that we're doing, and takes the work of cybersecurity and recognizes that without cybersecurity, without that secure foundation, we can't build upon all these other things that we're really seeking, like privacy, reliability, resilience, provenance. Where did something come from? And can I trust the source of where it came from? It's a really interesting stack of things that become harder and harder to talk about, and harder to kind of get our hands wrapped around, because frankly, the way that we're thinking about these issues hits us all across our organizations. So it's not just a one place stop, a chief privacy officer who's got it all covered. Like, we're finding ourselves working in deeper partnerships. And so digital trust really allows us to kind of break into a space where we can bring all those things together, because we all want to be secure. We want our data, our intellectual property to be safe. We want to respect the privacy of the folks that are in our environments, and frankly, to think really, really deeply about what that data sovereignty could mean, what that respect for their privacy could mean, and to do it in an international context where privacy laws from one jurisdiction aren't going to look the same as they look someplace else. We want to enable agency, and this is the one I really love, like thinking through how is it that we can actually architect our environments, that we can create digital experiences, what by virtue of the experiences that they're having with us, we actually give more and empower more the folks that we're working with. We'll talk a little bit later about different mechanisms to really do that, but I think we're in just such an amazing age. Everything from digital identities to verified credentials. We can really think differently about how to empower people as we're architecting these, and then ultimately to ensure that the digital trust is part of all of those experiences. And that really, I think, leads into some interesting conversations that I'm hoping that the chat can be pretty lively today, as we all think about the work that we're embarking on, whether that's artificial intelligence, better empowered student services, all sorts of things.
And
I'll
so,
stop
Donna,
there a
just to
second.
follow
Yeah,
up on your question, so what we're seeing is for folks, it's the
yeah,
traditional IAM community. It's a mix of everybody from the CISO title to the director to
great.
identity engineer to developer. And for me, this is one of those things as we continue to emerge this field, we're trying to coalesce a whole bunch of different disciplines into one
Right,
thing. So that's what I'm seeing.
right.
Keep an eye on the chat, but I'll let you do your thing.
No, that's great. That's great. So can I ask, do we have anybody that considers themselves like cybersecurity adjacent?
And you can go ahead and pop the things in the chat and I will sort of summarize them up.
Yeah, please do. Please do. Please do. And I love that we can have and frankly, that the community can talk vicariously through you, Chris. That's going to be great fun.
I'll do my best.
No, we got this. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about taking action, because I think that's one of the things that, let's assume that we agree with the premise, whether it's modernizing identity or going towards a zero trust mindset, like however your initiatives are already in flight. I think the trickiest thing is figuring out what are the actions we can do and how do we organize those actions in such a way that we can actually like help people come along the journey with us, that we can reach out across our organizations outside of just the traditional cybersecurity groups, and really work with everything from network engineers to developers that might be over in athletics or with alumni foundations, right? Suddenly trying to think through very different ways of collaborating. Let me ask Chris, are most of our colleagues from higher ed universities, or do we have kind of a milieu out there?
Well, mostly higher ed, certainly folks from Internet 2 and others, but mostly higher ed, at least what I'm seeing. And just to your security question, we've got a few answers, but it's more around, I think a lot of folks still struggling institutionally. Where does IAM fit as an organization? Is it part of cybersecurity? I'm having the same conversation home with my team. Do I have it report up to my CISO? Do I keep it somewhere else? So I think this is going to be an emergent area, again, in just my sort of casual conversations with peer CIOs. It's not entirely clear where it belongs because we haven't built the discipline, not unlike what we were doing forming information security organizations ourselves 15 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And so I think part of the challenge here, if you're thinking about, let's say, security by design, privacy by design, take those two, is really breaking down what is this work, who does that work, who traditionally has done the work, who traditionally may have done the work, but it not be part of a proper job description. It kind of just evolved that way that we ended up doing it. And then kind of stepping back and saying, okay, well, if we had a chance to re-architect, if we had a chance to rethink the model, where would we fit that work? And how would we empower people who are in the process of, let's say, provisioning identity for libraries or stewarding identities for alumni or for retirees, right? Very different aspects of that. Like how can we take new affordances, new technology that's available to us and rethink it? Like what a great opportunity. So the workbook, the playbook really has two different work streams and then kind of a call for an optimistic future. And I'm not going to go into all of that today, but I am going to kind of give you a sense of the kinds of work that while I was at Arizona State University, which I just came here to the University of Toronto after being there for 6 years, give you a sense of what that space looks like at Arizona State University. So a lot of this is work that we were doing in situ. And then as I'm coming here to U of T, mapping and finding the places on campus where like we're all facing the same things, and the teams here have been doing some pretty extraordinary work in parallel. I imagine, Chris, your teams too, right? So I'd love to hear like what are those initiatives that are the big ones, and I'll give you some places where we can kind of dive into that in a little bit. So I roughly break it out and prioritize a first work stream that's all about people. It's all about the humans that we're actually working with. It's all about the stakeholders that we have that we're serving, the people that we bring to the table. The second work stream is really about the engineering and technology. There's tons of work there, trying to keep it somewhat simple and prioritize, and then kind of embracing the future. So this is roughly what we're going to talk about today. Playbook goes into deep dives on all this stuff, but I picked out a few that we can kind of highlight. And then in the Q&A, if you want to go deeper on something else, we surely can. I'll pause there a little bit, mostly to breathe. Okay, and we'll go on. So I think one of the things, as we're sitting in the space of cybersecurity and reading NIST best practices or guidance that we might have, encouragement that we might have from organizations like CISA or EDUCAUSE or others, lots of attention in all of the frameworks and all the conversation around engaging our communities, recognizing that it's spear phishing and other forms of phishing or pushing or vishing or all those that are often the place where our credentials get compromised and things kind of go awry. And frankly, also recognizing that, with a sense of who we are as universities, is playing in the higher ed space, we want to be as generous as we can with provisioning emails for whether it's visiting faculty or students. There's all sorts of play in that space. So one of the things that I think we get in the recommendations are to do lots of community engagement, to increase our training, and to think about tabletops. So I wanted to start there a little bit, primarily because we are sitting in the month of June. And we are just a few months away from October and Cybersecurity Awareness Month, which is kind of a call to action. Like this is the perfect time when it's a little bit quieter on some fronts. To really think about how can we engage folks in the fall and what mechanisms can we do to really, really lean in to working with our communities and bringing them in so that as we're looking at, I don't know, say modernizing identity, maybe a homegrown system that we built 12, 15, 25 years ago. I don't know, Chris, do you have any of those homegrown stacks of technology that you're
We have about 20 years of various stacks of those technologies,
right?
viciously pivoting mostly around our identity platform right now, which is why for us, we're deep into IGA conversations. And Don, I just asked a question related to what you just put in the chat for folks to answer.
Yeah.
Are you adopting NIST frameworks as part of your IAM governance and rollout? And I will
What
say
are you
just
hearing?
quickly, my non-scientific counting of people is we have a good distribution of folks in North America, principally in the US and Canada. I do not know the moral equivalent to NIST in Canada, so my apologies for my lack of Canadian knowledge on that side. But
That's okay. We also lean into NIST.
wonderful. That makes my life
Yeah.
much easier.
Yeah. Yeah, but it's an interesting conversation right now, right? And let's just assume that you've got parts of the campus that are on the road to CMMC level 2. Who may actually already have that as a requirement because they're already doing contracts for which, if we were to do the controls mapping today, it would look an awful lot like what we ended up with CMMC level 2. Let's say that same group of researchers has a pretty ambitious research agenda. And so that's going to grow over the next 3 to 5 years. So we're trying to get ahead of that now. One of the things that I think that we can really lean into events this fall is to try to help prioritize and contextualize and socialize what that road is going to look like and figure out where are the opportunities for us to actually be working together. I think that Tabletops as an engagement strategy is a really phenomenal approach. One, it's fun. It gives this opportunity, as you were saying, Chris, for our IAM teams who are trying to figure out like how to meet the hunger that they're seeing. It kind of gives you a scaffold to put some very concerted conversations into, to actually play through scenarios that would be helpful to understanding the road ahead, and then to get some real consensus, some real coalition building around what is that work that's not necessarily going to be the technology work of rolling out an IGA strategy, or figuring out the last mile of multi-factor, right? We need to do all of that too, but contextualize it alongside our business partners.
And Donna,
So
can I ask
that,
you to answer one quick question there? Because
of course, yeah,
and I will
go
apologize.
ahead.
I already threw out the IGA acronym without defining it myself, right? IGA for me is
Okay.
governance and automation, about sort of provisioning. But one of the questions I had is about CMMC, because we all love using C and M, which are both my initials, unfortunately, in all sorts of acronyms. Could you define CMMC briefly in terms of where it fits? And for those of you who are up to your eyeballs in InfoSec and federal government contracts, I apologize in advance. But for those of you who aren't, if you just give a sort of brief definition of what that means, that would be great.
Yeah, Chris, do you want to take that one on since you brought it up? No.
I am sadly at the stage of my career where, IGA, I'm good. The CMMC, I think it was one of the ones you had mentioned as part of the contracts. I do not know them off the top of my head, but I will pull it up while we're talking.
No, yeah, well, and ask a question. So CMMC has been quite a few years in the making, but it's essentially for the U.S. It's a cybersecurity maturity model that'll actually be designed. It originally was quite a few levels, looked like a big layer cake. They've kind of narrowed the field. I think most of our campuses are going to be looking at getting to level 2 in maturity, level 3 in maturity, trying to figure out where their researchers need to be in order to comply with a set of new expectations coming out of agencies in the US. What's interesting there, and it's been about 9 months since I've been out in Washington, D.C., listening to policymakers and legislators. So it's kind of, I think CMMC is kind of held still a little bit, that I feel somewhat confident in this. There's a goal, a stated goal on the behalf of CISA and other agencies, that what will happen is that we'll start seeing more and more umbrellaing of regulatory requirements into CMMC, that it'll kind of be a place where we can normalize a little bit, the death by regulation, the 1,000 cuts of clauses that we're concerned about in terms of trying to keep up with all the compliance. So it'd be lovely to have something that's an umbrella, where you could take your various NIST frameworks or your CIS, more action-oriented framework, and be able to kind of hone in on something that helps with sense making on the campus. Now, if you look at CMMC, because it's a maturity model, that level 1 is really, correct me if I'm wrong, community, something like 17. I think we settled in at 17 different things, and they're basics of security. They're all things we'd aspire to. The devil's in the details. So some of those, to be fully compliant all the way down to the letter, might take more maturity in some of our environments than necessarily. I think that's usually identity and networks that end up being the places where we're kind of a little uncomfortable with how closely we'd be just at level 1. But level 2 is where you really do need to be able to demonstrate a set of controls that will, but they're going to feel really familiar, because you're going to be able to map them into CSF and into the other frameworks. And lots of great folks are in the process of doing that work now.
Thank you for saving me on the CMMC definition. My brain doesn't work so well anymore. I popped
No,
one
that's
quick
all
one we
right.
pulled up. And so, well, this is, again, as Donna said, traditional maturity model. For those of you in the incumbent space who remember going through various bronze and silver and things like that, it's the same rough concept, except really more broadly to information security. Elements of it did come out of some of the defense space, but it's really across the federal government. What we're seeing now is we're seeing through contracts assertions of emergent CMMC compliance being required for successful issuance and completion of contracts. So that's a sort of touchy line right now. And I know our research folks are very concerned about that, especially any research that has already explicitly called out CMMC as a current or emergent obligation.
Yeah, exactly. And they're probably current obligations. So, in terms of a call to action, this is a great opportunity to, one, identify your researchers if you don't know already. If you're in the state where the silos of excellence have just meant that we really aren't aware of who's already got that going on, or what mechanisms have they taken to protect themselves. CMMC gets to be a little bit of a rallying cry to kind of say, okay, well, here's a big thing that we're going to want to either immediately adhere to or keep on the front edge for, so that we can be competitive when we're going out for grants. It's a nice, and the intention of other agencies to try to look at it as an umbrella. That's great. Director Jenny Sterley at CISA has been a fantastic advocate of us trying to make sense, recognizing how onerous some of these compliance requirements will be. So it really is a very nice way of kind of pulling that together.
Great. And I just asked, just for me, as more of a question for the audience is, I know my CISO is very deeply involved in CMMC. We talk about it on a regular basis. I'm curious for folks who are more in an IAM role, has this come into your orbit? Is this in your radar? Something the InfoSec team is just doing? And I realize there's all sorts of different organization structures, but I'm curious to know if that's emerged at your institution as a core component of that CMMC compliance and reporting obligation.
That's a great question. It's a great question. And if it hasn't yet, I think one of the things that's a challenge, and part of why I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about things like Tabletops, is that we can start working with our CISOs, working with our teams that are doing the security awareness and the more event-driven kind of the awareness building sides of our security postures, like the teams doing that work, to actually go in and try to create some scenarios that'll help us interrogate that, and then use those as excuses to bring the right people to the table and say, hey, we want to do a tabletop specifically on something that'll help us understand the risks when it comes to defense-oriented contracts that are aspiring to CMMC. So let's design an experience, get together for a couple of hours, run that through, and see what we learn. That's exactly what tabletops are supposed to do. They're best driven when you've actually got a, hey, I wonder how we would handle a kind of question, and then can kind of build out what you would do in terms of injects and the other kinds of fun things that you do during the tabletop. There are great templates and things out there we can kind of pull together to help you if you're starting with that. Here at the University of Toronto, the team has made licenses available across the campus to a group called Immersive Views, I think. Which are essentially pre-built scenarios that we did in party with an external vendor to help us kind of have ones that tactical teams across the campus can run in this really beautiful online facilitated environment. Also really great because like the best strategies are if you're tactical teams that are trying to figure out, okay, how do I protect a research enclave, or how do I protect a cloud environment, or whatever it is that they decide to actually have as their scenario. If you can intentionally design those with then on top of that, strategic ones where you actually bring together the folks that are working in research data management, the folks that are working in research compliance, the folks that are working with your IRBs, like think of the partners that you would ideally have around the table. And then the tabletop can be the mechanism by which you all come together and actually try to get a shared understanding of what you're up against and what work you'd like to do.
And Don, to that end, I want to give a plug to, we've had success in our region with CISA. And again, this is not the community from sustaining agriculture. I'm sure like some of you have farm shares that do that. This is the other CISA out of the federal government. That's a function out of Department of Homeland Security that have been great partners for us.
Amazing.
So the CMMC stuff is technically coming out of Department of Defense, but CISA does a lot of reference work to that. So I popped a link in the chat to some of the CISA resources. But if you have not at an institution had a chance to meet with your regional CISA rep, I would strongly recommend it. They're getting out there. They've been doing great hiring. It's a real good partnership. And this is for identity. This is for InfoSec basics. We had a great conversation about E911 requirements. But if you have not talked to them, find your CISA rep in your region, again, in the US. They've been great partners for us, at least in the Northeast.
Yeah, they're fabulous. When I do executive level tabletop, so bringing in leadership in a college or in a school, or ones that I do, I just did one for President Crow at ASU and kind of the President Crow level leadership. I always, and CISA never says no. Like I always bring in one of their representatives. I bring in somebody from the state. Like I said, there's just such lovely opportunities to actually invite and engage, and then to help the rest of your community kind of be aware of, oh, we've got partners at CISA that are here regionally that can help us. It also kind of helps broaden the thinking about who's available to you. Okay. Anything else on this one, Chris? Or I think we'll move forward.
Go ahead.
Okay. Okay. I think we're in a period of having a whole lot of fun with identity. And Chris, you were mentioning this earlier, right? As we're looking at so many things out inside of our technology, our wild technology environs, leaning in, and to which, like, the answer is, oh, you'd like to do that? Well, we kind of need some thinking around how we do identity. Identity and data governance turn out to be two pillars by which a lot of really interesting things can kind of happen. And so suddenly, whereas a few years ago, it might have been a bit of a stretch to kind of say, okay, well, we need identity for X, Y, and Z, and here's the rationale for it. I think it's becoming more obvious to our colleagues across campus that the kinds of things that they want to do really do hinge on solid identity. I picked David Bowie because he's one of my favorites in terms of actually thinking about like very different identities by which at the end of the day, you all know it's David Bowie. And that's kind of a real challenge for us. Now, how do we think about so many stakeholders that are coming to the universities and a changing nature of how higher ed is working across the board, and then really have identity systems that match? Recognizing that we've kind of built some, in some cases, pretty bespoke and really, really, really thoughtful, intentionally designed technology over the years to solve certain problems. And now we need to do that and integrate them into really large systems. So let's talk about some of the digital transformation. And this is one, Chris, where I would expect we could maybe solicit from the chat, what else folks are up to. So any big categories that I've missed, or drill down into some of these. When you're trying to figure out.
If I can interrupt you for a sec, we're going to try to have one of the participants, they raised a hand, and we're going to see.
Oh, sweet. Let's do it.
Actually ask a question that way. And so Jean and Jennifer, I'll defer to your technical wizardry to see if we can pull that off. There you go.
Go ahead, Emilio.
Oh, excellent. I was just wondering if the cybersecurity maturity model certification program, if you have any context or any previous experience with them, like what the results of that was, kind of like the end outcomes. I know it's kind of like a heavy question, but
I don't think so yet, Emilio. And Chris, I'll encourage you to respond too. It's really early. Like the standard hasn't been holding still very long. We now have something that isn't agreed to, and like we know what the levels are, and so it's not moving around. And we're starting to get a better set of third parties who can actually do third-party attestation to these. But even those are brand new. And the last time I had a deep dive with one of the firms that was doing that, there were only a handful of very large private sector defense firms that had actually gone through the attestation. So we don't have lessons learned yet. It's way in the early stages. But that's part of what's exciting, because we know it's coming. We know that they didn't make this stuff up. It already maps to existing frameworks. So work that already is in the realm. They should be doing this stuff already. So that's kind of a nice way of kind of rallying around it. What do you think, Chris?
Yeah, I'll jump in. And again, this is like, I'm divulging the grayness of my beard at this point. Like, for those of you who sat around and walked through the early days of PCI SAQs when there was only 4 of them, or the early days of HIPAA privacy rule or security rule, right? There are these broad mandates of you all have to comply with the privacy rule. We're like, what does that mean? We're like, we're working on it. And then it was like, no, you have to comply with the security rule. And here's the data breach. You're like, what does that mean? Well, we're working on it. I feel like we're going through the same thing in CMMC. And I would entirely agree with Donna. At the top level, defense contractors are living and breathing this on a regular basis because the requirements are coming initially out of DoD. It is an emergent space. But Emilio, to get to sort of what you're getting at, if you've lived through the pain of PCI certification or other certifications, you recognize that there's a sort of iterative process. There's like standards, there's compliance, there's third parties, and eventually you will see something that looks like an attestation. And then what I expect to see is NSF and NIH saying, send us your CMMC certificate of compliance for whatever that is against a 2.0 standard Rev November 2023 or whatever. That's what it will start looking like. And so I think you can expect that over time. to hit that degree of maturity that we see now in PCI and some of these other domains. And it will be very heavily based off the NIST frameworks.
Yeah, and ahead of that, like at ASU, they put out a page for researchers, a web page for researchers in the area where they've got all the resources to offer technology support to researchers, that has wording that a researcher can put into grant applications that shows the journey that we're on. So it's an important thing, I think, to be realizing that your researchers are likely the ones that for which this is going to be a compliance issue. They're already thinking about it because they're trying to figure out what their funding opportunities are going to be looking like 18, 24 months ago, right? They're watching what the funding cycles will be. And so being proactive there and being a good partner, being able to say, hey, there's going to be some stuff from my team that we can do to help, and reaching out, that'll make everything go so much faster. But CMMC is like one of many different mechanisms that we have to kind of reach into the work that we're doing for identity. So it's an opportunity on the research side, but here I've just had a handful of different kinds of opportunities that we have from very different parts of the campus. So if you're in the midst of a student information system that you're rethinking, human resource management, that's a project that's been happening for about the last 3 years at ASU. Anything in terms of, I don't know, rolling out and maturing your ServiceNow or Workday environments, alumni management, especially as we start thinking, oh, we've got a day and age now where we want to be engaging with alumni differently. Finance and accounting, like there's just so many different things by which being able to say, I know who this person is, I know what's expected out of this person, what access, what privileges, what kinds of things they're engaging with, CRM systems. How did I not put CRMs on here? They're
Especially
all
from Arizona State, right? I mean, you
I
can't
know.
CRM for Arizona State. Donna,
I've already moved on.
CGA put it in from Purdue, and I know Purdue is up to their eyeballs in all things IAM. They've done some great presentations recently.
Yeah.
It's almost silly in some ways that we're talking about this stuff, because we all implemented student systems, we all implemented HR systems, ERP, CRMs, and only now are we like, hey, who did we put on those systems in the first place? And I was the sort of, the odd man out at the ERP summit we had at our own university system, as we're talking about, we have to do this in governance. I'm like, can we just start with identity? Like, I just want to know who. If we can start with who, I am all into roles and permissions and privilege. But if we've not rationalized our account claiming process, our account validation process, our recertification process, I'm concerned about the richness of role management if we don't know who is actually plugged into those roles.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And then let's look at what's emerged in the last 18 months, where we're trying to figure out, okay, well, how can we get better at learning with AIs? And how could we have financial aid services with AI chatbots? And how do we do all sorts of different things? This generation of learners, one of my colleagues described them as AI natives. Much like we had digital natives the first time I've heard that phrase. I love it. But let's think about they're going to be so good at being able to tell whether or not the information that they're getting from a bot, which by the way, like the early research says that they're fine with bots. They want a person when they want a person, but they're not offended. They're not natively offended by having bots. Okay, so that's great. But as soon as it is obvious that the information that they're getting doesn't match who they are and what they were expecting, then their trustfulness in that goes way down. So our ability to get operational efficiencies, to get orchestration automation, to actually get our people to the place where they can do less manual work, all of that is kind of predicated on whether or not the bots understand who they're talking to and can be delivering the right information. Kind of goes back to, we need really solid identity and we need really solid data governance. And now's the time, if not before, like use things like CMMC and your rollout of new systems on the ERP side with the sense of urgency of, we got to do this now, or the AIs are going to sound dumb and nobody will listen to them.
And so one of my hopes, and this is again, betraying how long I've been doing this stuff, when I was early in my career in InfoSec, once you started seeing EDUCAUSE with Security Task Force and this, and you start seeing the information security conversation coming to a CIO table, a board table, it was a huge recognition. What I'm seeing with IAM now, with CMMC and these other things, is IAM almost growing up in a way, and I mean that in the pejorative possible way. Some of you have been doing this a long time. Some of you have, lived through the pain of installing shibboleths by hand well before packages. Thank God for Internet 2's and Steve Zoppi's work to get all that better. But this is the time, right? This is relevant. Identity is everywhere. That experience, that trust is no longer just an issue of, oh, I'm sorry, you're going to have to come down to the help desk with your ID so we can reset your password. It's, you're going to lose digital learners if you don't figure this out. And that's going to tie into revenue and long-term operations. So
Absolutely.
my suggestion, I think Donna has done a great job presenting this, is like, now is the time. Like, I think the IAM community can step up and say, hey, we are actually at the adult table. We're going to be at the board table. We're going to be in the conversation because this is core to business. This is no longer just that technology that stitches things together that gives me access to a magazine.
Exactly. And we're going to need it for the foreseeable future. Like this isn't a moment of time where we can, put together an IGA initiative with one-time funding and check the box and say it's done, because we're going to really be evolving. The business models will be evolving. Our mechanism by which we think about how we're delivering educational content to alumni, to continuing education and professional development, to industry sectors that are starting to get. KSU's done some really interesting work with YouTube, where you can actually start taking classes on YouTube through Crash Course with Hank Green and amazing people. Those individuals have probably had YouTube accounts since before they were 13 and allowed to declare it. They think of themselves in terms of being in a space where they've been learning on YouTube right alongside, I don't know, Canadians like Maddie Matheson making hamburgers or whatever. I adore him. Their sense of learning is this really, really cool, but also completely different model. And yet ASU wants to start giving them credit for experiences they're having in that, respecting the identity and frankly, the kind of confidence building that they'd have on the journey until they become then something that's a more traditional looking identity. It's crazy. But this means, like just on the slide, completely different places where IAM gets to have a seat at the table strategically and really be helpful. Really think about how we're going to reach out to our audiences. Are there more questions? We're about 6 minutes, Jean, and I'm thinking maybe we want to go directly into questions unless we have a little bit of time, or I'll kind of talk about some, like, what is Donna thinking about the future? But I think
Donna,
I'll give her
what you're thinking about the future for like 5 more minutes. That'll get us right to 2 o'clock. We'll leave us 10
Let's do
minutes
that.
for questions. I'll do my best to correlate them. Again, you can pop them in ahead of time. Don't wait for the 10 minutes and we'll do it. And if we can work the magic and not drive Jennifer nuts, we'll pop some people's voices up as well.
Okay, got it. I'm going to run through these, and you can reach out to me. I'll share my LinkedIn if you're interested in kind of diving deep more. I'm incredibly, like, brazenly optimistic about where the future is going. Not only do we have robust companies that can actually respond to an RFP for identity modernization, and they're doing really great stuff that's going to help us out, but we've also got more nascent technology that I think is really interesting. So one of them are leaning into being more thoughtful about how we do federated models. We're starting to see things like Twitter explodes, and so social media companies start leaning into protocols. And those protocols are really around being able to take your social media audience and move it from one environment to the other. So great things happening with kind of the crazy folks over at Blue Sky. Mastodon's been doing this for 6 or 7 years. I think there's some really interesting lessons to be learned by the models that come out of that for identity. Discord, for any of you that might be gamers, like these are models where you're kind of spinning up these micro environments that speak to specific audiences, and you want to be able to have the agency, back to kind of that value proposition, to be able to move from one to the other. Another component of that is federated learning, being able to put machine learning models and algorithms directly, say, on a phone, and having that data kept on the phone, and then pushing it to the cloud as data in the common ways of how we think about it. I don't know. People may have upset that apple cart this year. Well, we'll see what happens after this week's announcements. But in general, I think we've got more technology options for how to think about where data is kept and how to decentralize it, and then how we do things like learning, which all kind of leads into some privacy practices like privacy minimization. Let's have as little of that as possible. Selective disclosure, I think, is another really interesting one. This is where our identity systems would allow us to be able to say, hey, I am willing to let XYZ, let's say recruiting firms, know that I'm going to graduate in a year, but I don't need them to actually be able to reach out to me yet. I can be part of a population that they really don't have too many details on until the moment where I actually want to selectively disclose and say, yeah, there's a value proposition there. So really different than just being, okay, well, the information's out in a directory and let's go scrape it off a directory. Or let's see what's allowed by policy for us to be able to share. Very different mechanisms to kind of think about that. And then zero knowledge proofs, I think I would go out and Google what's happening in California around the Sacramento area with driver's licenses. Like I've forgotten, I think there are 31 data points of data on a driver's license. But now they're looking at mechanisms by which if you've joined into some of the capabilities with digital identity, you can just make your app and then the vendor knows, hey, Donna can buy wine. It doesn't actually need to know that I'm as old, if not older than Chris. Doesn't need that data, doesn't need to see any of that. It just needs verified, absolutely true. The state of California says Donna's old enough, go. And she can make that purchase. So I think there's really interesting ways for us to disclose less, give more agency for what's disclosed, for us to think about, let's verify that something's true and be able to have an identity act on it without assuming that we've got to have all the data behind it. And for us to think through very different models of how we architect it. Too much fun to have in 5 minutes. There's another link if you guys want to check that out, but I won't stay here. And there's my LinkedIn if you want to reach out. Otherwise, I'm going to hand over the mic, I think, to my teams here.
Great. Well, we've got a couple of questions here.
Oh, sweet.
And Pete, I'm going to jump to your question second because I think there's a number of us that could talk about it for hours. CJ, I'm going to jump to your question. The question from CJ at Purdue is, how are you maintaining digital anonymity from the technology used when your client's whole existence can be wrapped up in Apple, Microsoft, Google? And I was going to ask a similar question to this is, there's this like promise and peril of social identity. Like the promise of social identity is, oh, thank God, I do not need to set my undergraduate students' parents' passwords and then find a way to reset their passwords when it's time to pay their bill. Because many of us have been there. It's painful. And so on the one hand, I'm like, this is great. I can consume, any of your social identifiers. Your student told me you're the parent. They've done the identity assertion, which is good. We just want you to pay the bill. Your password is between you and Facebook, not me. But where does that go from a privacy perspective, right? And I think what we see is there's like tension right now. I mean, Apple sort of reinforced this yesterday. We all see Microsoft and Google. They're trying to carve up the identity ecosystem. And that's a privacy risk that almost we can't control. And so, I can think this sort of far edge condition, like, why am I in the identity game? I'll let Google do all of it. But then I'm like, wait a second, like there are students, and I want to go back to this principle of least privilege. I'd love your thoughts on that, of sort of how do you think about digital anonymity in a world where it's so easy through OIDC to just expose external identity provider credentials into our internal systems, but at what cost? Any thoughts you have on that would be great. Thank you, CJ, for the question.
Yeah, it's a great question. And we could have a whole session just on this. I'll start with I think that education as a sector and higher ed as a sector has a really interesting opportunity because like we're universities that aren't going anywhere. The University of Toronto is like almost at its 200-year anniversary. I just learned this week all sorts of things that the university is actually older than the country of Canada. So let's say that our universities are going to have more staying power potentially than what's happening in the governments around them. That they've been institutions that have been with us since the 12th century, and they're institutions that have a mechanism, like instilled in them, a mechanism for building trust through things like attribution and research and transparency. And all sorts of like lovely things that are just part of how we think about, what's the right way to actually add knowledge to the world. I think that puts us in a really interesting way to rethink identity and to say, okay, well, learning is a thing that happens, and let's partner across education and think about how we can be stewards of the elements that create somebody's sense of who they are and how they want to present themselves in the world. And if we can model, if our campuses can model what that looks like, and do it in ways that are really respectful of the fact that the person that you are when you're 13 on YouTube and the person that you are when you're 33 as a seasoned principal investigator or out in the workforce now trying to decide, do you want continuing education courses or do you want to be all in on an MBA? Like all of that milieu, I think, is such a wonderful place for us to, for all the right reasons, really understand and create models for it. We're not going to see the industry is not going to come up with models in the same way for the same motivations. And governments will have different challenges with trying to do that, and different challenges with all the services that they present. I just think that we sit in a really interesting place to experiment. So we
I
should be
would completely
experimenting.
agree. And, I'll take a line from a friend of mine who's at
Yeah,
Microsoft. Back to your 12th century analog, like, what is our product? Like, yes, we teach, we train, but like, really, in many cases, our product is a diploma, which is really just an assertion. It's an attribute and about an identity manifests
right.
in a pretty piece of heavyweight paper with a nice seal and somebody's signature on it. But like, bring that to a digital world, and without going all down the how do you technologically do it, that's interesting. Like, that is that trust
Interesting.
that we're selling. It's a really interesting thing. So I do agree. I believe higher education is uniquely positioned with respect to this. We're not trying to monetize your identity, unlike the Googles and the Microsofts and the Metas and the Apples of the world. Not that we don't work on a revenue basis, but like, it's a different value proposition. I think we can be a position of trust. We can have that conversation in a way that I think other industries struggle.
Yeah, which feels to me like what an extraordinary call to action. And how do we think across, all the partners that are doing the different things that I mentioned earlier that have different reasons for leaning into that, different things that they're providing as a service. Yeah, that's just so much fun. I don't know if I fully answered that question or if there's more we want to dig into.
Donna, I'd say, I think for your part, I think we could do a whole hour just talking about
Ah,
that one question alone. So CJ, thank you for that question. That would be great.
yeah, absolutely.
Well, let's see. Pete, you had a question specifically around Open LDAP, Shibboleth, AD, Windows machines, on-premise servers, Google Workspace. I will say, I agree with you. There's probably too much there. I know there's a number of folks that I can recognize the names just on the chat that would be happy to. I'll just talk very briefly sort of in this space, sort of what we're doing, because we came from the same space. And there's a portion of me that's terrified of this, but we came from the same on-prem, Open LDAP, SHIB front end, AD for machine authentication. We ended up deciding to move all of our stuff to Entra ID. And it's with this like tension of like, on the one hand, I'm glad we're not running as much on-prem authentication workflows. On the other hand, I gave it to Microsoft. Like, seriously, what's happened in the last 25 years? But that's the approach we're taking. And it's an interesting business risk trade-off. So if you want, Pete, feel free to follow up with me offline. I can put you in touch with some of our folks to talk about how we address that problem. It is by no means perfect, but we jumped into that same issue for exactly what you're talking about. Absolutely. So Allison put in a comment about, the challenge for
Yeah,
any of these solutions is what you can do in your own environment. And all of us have these sort of distinct bespoke environments that look 90% similar, but that 10% that's different really,
right,
really matters.
right,
So
right.
Donna, a question I have for you specifically with that, I know it's been early, but in your transition from ASU to Toronto, what surprised you most in sort of how major institutions differ and how they handle identities?
Oh, yeah, ask an easy one, why don't you, Chris?
Exactly,
Um,
yeah.
I will say that at ASU, I was there for 6 years. ASU Online was at 42,000 students when I started. I got into this work because of the velocity of that. And that's where I really, really got an appreciation of the challenge that we're up to. I think that ASU's been on a journey to understand what needs to happen across the campus, so that whether it's somebody working in Salesforce or somebody moving the HR system to Workday, uh, they've really partnered with the central IT group to be able to move. Nate Wilkin and his teams are moving towards an identity graph, and modernizing their identity in some really interesting ways. And that happy to introduce you guys to that team and to talk about the journey that they're on. Here at U of T, the same kind of excellence is happening, but it's happening with a different driver because U of T's got 98,000 students as opposed to, the numbers at ASU, which are also pretty, like, they're both big institutions, but they're not online students. They're students that are having an experience across the 3 campuses and a really strong research, and really strong international component, which is a different set of identity challenges. So they're different entry points. And I think this kind of speaks to Allison's challenge, right? What can you support in your environment? Part of what you have to look at is what are the things that the university is really trying to lean into and to solve for. In our case, trying to think through how do we create really amazing experiences for the undergraduates that are going to go into the graduate cycle, and that porosity between undergrads and research as a place to start, ASU Online as a place to start for their digital systems. Every university is going to have a different set of challenges, and then you can kind of lean into, okay, where's some momentum both on the business side and with the technologists to try to push this
Completely
forward.
agree. Yeah, and I'm just going to follow up another question from
You bet.
Nadeem at Springfield College. And Nadeem, I'm not sure, is that Springfield College in Springfield, Mass, in which case you're like 25 minutes down the road. So you and I can get together and talk about this at some point. But his question is, how about small colleges and universities? Toronto, ASU, UMass, large R1 institutions, lots of resources available. I can say, yeah, just write the A5 check to Microsoft, and that makes the Entra ID problem kind of go away. I talk with some of my peers, because we exist in a consortium as well, of 5 colleges that vary very greatly, from Amherst College with a huge endowment to Hampshire College, which is seemingly always on the cusp of some financial uncertainty. The solution set may differ, but the problem space doesn't. And so I don't know if you have any.
So right.
I haven't been there. I've talked with my peers there, but I think that's an interesting challenge, especially as you go to these cloud-based identity services. How do you manage that? Are we going to get to a place where the market just commoditizes these to a point that the price point isn't viable for some? It's an interesting space for small schools. And I think, honestly, we've got our challenges at large R1s. I don't envy that challenge at a smaller school. But Nadeem, I'd be happy to connect offline as well.
Yeah, as a problem space, it feels like a Mandelbrot fractal set, right? It doesn't matter at what scale you're looking at the fractal, you're still looking at the same set of dynamics that we're facing. And I worry about it with K through 12 too. There's still students, there's still identities, and there's an increasing amount challenges there. So this is part of why I'm really passionate about identity professionals, not only thinking about what's immediately in front of them in terms of the project sets that they have, but how we can be pushing towards different challenges that can be solved through protocols. So leaning into verified credentials and really being participants and active in that space around what we need for a verified credential. Because ultimately, the right solutions are going to be ones for which there's open source solutions or low cost. I think of environments like Koali, environments that are really designed to be able to meet the needs of folks that otherwise couldn't afford it. And what we can't do is allow the security poverty line to essentially means that we have haves and have-nots of who gets to afford that. And frankly, those students are coming into their big institutions. So we don't want them coming in already having had vulnerabilities, when they were in 3rd grade, because their data was rich for a school district to get caught.
So
that's a hard answer, but
I agree with you. We have one more question, and I don't think we have enough time to really answer it. But the question is, what are you doing? Are you using open source? I mean, aside from a plug for our good friends at Internet 2 and all their ITAP components, right? The only solution is not just go out and pay Microsoft or Google a pile of money. There are ways to do this. And what I'm hoping to see is that ecosystem continue to emerge of integrators that are going to be able to support this. Because I know at some of these small schools, it's hard to find somebody who has technical expertise, but I think there are different price points that need to emerge. Internet 2's and InCommon's done a great job with their Catalyst program. I'm really hoping to see growth of that. I think there is absolutely, I've said this to every vendor I've talked to, there is a market opportunity for mid-market and small market schools to help address this issue that I have not seen anybody step into. I would love to see it, and I could see it absolutely being supported off the back of open source products and customized workflows. And I think that is going to be part of our solution set to hedge against that. Gene, I am pedantic in time, and it's making me twitchy that it's 2:11 and you told us 2:10.
Okay, we're good.
I could probably talk for another hour. I want to be very respectful of everybody else's time. So with that, I want to thank Donna for the excellent presentation and thank the audience for wonderful questions. But Gene, I will hand it back to you for logistics.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you both, Donna, for that very insightful presentation, and Chris for all of your moderating and fielding these questions. I mean, such a great discussion. And for those of you who are still with us and listening, if there's follow-on conversations that you want to have about this, can you put it in the chat right now before we say goodbye? We'd love to be able to know what you're interested in and how we can continue this conversation in more ways than one. So add it there. But I just want to close us out because we also want to thank all of you for tuning in and posting your questions, because it really does help keep the spirit of the presentation alive. So let me just share my screen one last time so that we can close out. Before you sign off today, you will see a quick 4-question survey that we hope you'll let us know what you thought of today's presentation. If you have overall feedback, please do contact me directly. And if this has inspired you to want to have a webinar and talk about things that you know or what's going on at your institution because you have a few things to share, please let us know that too. We're game. Tune in next month, July 17th at 1 p.m. Our next webinar is on the implementation of Grouper ABAC. So if you have Grouper happening or thinking about it and why you should be using it and how it could help you, please do tune in next month for that webinar. Again, many of you have asked, this event is being recorded, so we will be sending that out. It will be posted on the InCommon website as well, so please check there in a few days. Special thanks to Jennifer and the Internet 2 team who make this monthly event happen. All right, well, thanks again, Donna, Chris. We appreciate you being here. Thanks, everyone.